He was seconds from death. Then she did the unthinkable to save him. The billionaire's son's fate hung by a thread, and her next move shocked everyone. How far would she go to defy fate? Welcome back, my amazing family and friends. If you're ready to dive into this unforgettable story, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Tomorrow, I'll bring you another incredible tale you absolutely can't miss. Let's get started, and don't forget to like and share to help our community grow. The November rain came down in sheets over southeast Portland, turning the cracked pavement of Morrison Street into a minefield of potholes and reflected neon. Naomi Wright pulled her threadbare jacket tighter, the fabric doing little against the cold that had settled into her bones weeks ago. At 23, she'd learned that poverty wasn't just about empty pockets. It was about the way cold became a permanent resident in your body, the way hunger gnawed not just at your stomach but at your ability to think straight, to plan beyond the next meal. Her shift at Rose's Diner had ended 30 minutes ago, but she'd stayed to scrub down the grills, to mop floors that didn't need mopping, anything to delay the walk back to the single room she rented above the laundromat on 82nd Avenue. The room where the heat only worked half the time and the landlord, Mr. Chen, had already left 2 notices about late rent taped to her door. $217, she whispered to herself, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. That's what she was short. $217 between keeping a roof over her head and joining the growing number of people sleeping in tents along the Springwater corridor. The diner's owner, Rosie, a 60-year-old woman with hands worn rough from 4 decades of restaurant work, had pressed a leftover chicken sandwich into Naomi's hands before she left. You eat that tonight, baby girl. And don't you dare try to save it for tomorrow. I know you. Naomi had thanked her, fighting back tears. Pride was a luxury she couldn't afford, but it still stung every time someone saw through the careful facade she maintained, the bright smile she wore for customers, the cheerful energy she projected despite running on 4 hours of sleep and a diet of whatever mistakes came out of Rose's kitchen. She turned onto the darker stretch of Morrison, where the streetlights had been broken for months and the city seemed in no hurry to fix them. This part of town didn't get the attention the Pearl District or the West Hills received. Here, in the forgotten corners where people like Naomi struggled and survived, the infrastructure crumbled slowly while the city's attention, and money, flowed elsewhere. The rain intensified, and she quickened her pace, her sneakers squelching through puddles. She was thinking about the electricity bill, about whether she could convince the power company to give her another week, when she heard it. The engine first, a high-performance purr that didn't belong in this neighborhood, racing far too fast for wet roads and poor visibility. Then the screech of tires losing their grip on slick asphalt. And finally, the sound that would haunt her dreams for years to come. The sickening crunch of metal meeting wood, glass exploding, the violent percussion of a life interrupting its own trajectory. Naomi's head snapped toward the sound. 50 yards ahead, wrapped around the massive oak tree that had stood at the corner of Morrison and 34th for longer than she'd been alive, was a black Mercedes. New, expensive, the kind of car that cost more than she'd earn in 5 years. The front end had accordioned, the airbags deployed, and steam rose from the crushed hood like a mechanical death rattle. For a heartbeat, she stood frozen. Every survival instinct she'd honed during 3 years of homelessness and near homelessness screamed at her to keep walking. Rich people had insurance. They had people. They didn't need a broke black girl in a stained waitress uniform inserting herself into their crisis. Getting involved meant police, questions, time she couldn't afford to lose from her next shift. But then she saw the hand. Pressed against the driver's side window, pale fingers splayed against the glass, trembling. Not moving away. Not opening the door. Just there. A silent plea in the shape of a palm. Naomi's feet were moving before her mind finished its calculations. She'd spent enough time sleeping in her car, back when she'd had a car, to recognize the posture of someone trapped, hurt, fading. She ran, her worn sneakers pounding through puddles, the cold rain forgotten. As she got closer, she could make out more details. The driver was male, young, maybe her age or a few years older. Blonde hair matted with blood from a gash on his forehead. His eyes were open but unfocused, his expensive suit jacket torn at the shoulder. The driver's side door was jammed, crushed inward by the impact. Naomi tried the handle anyway, yanking with strength born of desperation. Nothing. The passenger side looked worse, completely caved in where the tree's thick trunk had invaded the car's interior space. "Hey!" she shouted, pressing her face close to the broken window. "Can you hear me? Are you okay?" The man's eyes drifted toward her voice, struggling to focus. His lips moved, but she couldn't hear him over the rain and the hissing from the engine. She pulled out her phone, a cracked iPhone 6 she'd bought third-hand, and dialed 911 with shaking fingers. 911. What's your emergency? There's been an accident on Morrison and 34th, Naomi said, her words tumbling out fast. A Mercedes wrapped around a tree. The driver's trapped and injured. I can see blood. He's not moving much. Units are being dispatched, the operator said calmly. Can you tell me? The smell hit her then, sharp and unmistakable even through the rain. Gasoline. Not just a leak but a steady stream, pooling under the car, spreading across the wet asphalt like an iridescent death sentence. There's gas leaking, Naomi interrupted, her voice rising. A lot of it. The engine's still hot, I can see steam. I need you to move away from the vehicle immediately, the operator said, and the sudden urgency in her voice made Naomi's stomach drop. If there's a fuel leak and the engine's hot, there's a risk of a spark. Naomi saw it before she could process it, a tiny orange flicker from somewhere in the engine compartment, kissing the gasoline vapor. Time seemed to slow, every disaster movie she'd ever seen playing in fast-forward through her mind. The fire would spread fast. The man inside, disoriented and trapped, wouldn't be able to get out. The doors were jammed. The rescue units were still minutes away. Minutes he didn't have. Are you there? Move away from the vehicle. Naomi dropped the phone. She'd never considered herself brave. Brave was for people who had something to lose, and she'd spent the last 3 years in a constant state of loss. Her parents to a house fire when she was 19, her college scholarship when grief and poverty made focusing impossible, her apartment, her car, her dignity, piece by piece until all that remained was the stubborn refusal to disappear completely. But standing there, watching smoke begin to curl from under the hood, watching the man inside press his blooded hand harder against the window like he could push his way through glass through sheer will alone, she discovered that bravery wasn't about what you had to lose. It was about what you couldn't live with if you walked away. The rear driver's side window had been shattered in the impact, leaving a jagged opening large enough for a person. If that person was small enough, desperate enough, and didn't mind getting cut to ribbons by broken glass. Naomi pulled off her jacket and wrapped it around her arm. Then she reached through the window frame, feeling for the manual door unlock. Her fingers found it. Pulled. Nothing. The door was too damaged, the frame too warped. The smoke was thicker now, no longer just steam. She could see orange starting to lick up from under the hood. Okay, she whispered to herself, to God, to the universe that had spent 3 years kicking her while she was down. Okay. She pulled herself through the window. The broken glass tore at her jacket, her jeans, found the skin underneath. Pain bloomed sharp and immediate, but she pushed through, contorting her body through the narrow opening. She landed awkwardly in the back seat, her shoulder hitting the center console hard enough to make her vision blur. The man in the driver's seat turned his head toward her, his movements slow and dreamlike. Up close, she could see he was younger than she'd thought, maybe 25, with the kind of refined features that spoke of good genetics and better nutrition. His gray eyes tried to focus on her, confusion written across his face. Why are you? His words slurred together, consciousness slipping. Doesn't matter, Naomi said, already moving. She squeezed between the front seats, fighting against the deployed airbag, the twisted metal, the smoke that was starting to fill the cabin. I need you to stay with me, okay? What's your name? Theodore. He blinked slowly. My father is going to be so angry. Yeah, well, let's keep you alive so he can be angry, Naomi said, her hands checking his seatbelt. It was stuck, the buckle jammed. Of course it was. She felt around his waist, found the emergency belt cutter in the center console, thank God for expensive cars and their safety features, and sawed through the belt. The smoke was thicker, black now, making her eyes water and her lungs burn. The heat was building. They had seconds, maybe less. Theodore slumped forward without the belt holding him upright. Naomi caught him, her arms screaming in protest. He was taller than her, heavier, and only semi-conscious. Getting him through that back window was going to be impossible. Unless she made it not impossible. She'd been a track runner in high school, back when she'd had a future that included things like sports and college and dreams bigger than surviving. She'd learned how to push her body beyond what it thought were its limits. She'd learned that strength wasn't about muscles, it was about refusing to accept the word can't. Naomi hooked her arms under Theodore's shoulders and pulled. He groaned, his head lolling against her shoulder. She ignored the blood soaking into her shirt, the way her lungs screamed for clean air, the heat that was now radiating from the engine in waves that promised imminent disaster. She pulled, dragging him inch by inch into the back seat, his expensive shoes catching on the gear shift, his weight threatening to pin her against the seat. "Come on," she grunted, her muscles burning. "Come on, come on." The back windshield exploded outward with a crack that made her scream. Later, she'd learned that it was the heat causing the glass to shatter. In the moment, it felt like a gift, a new escape route, wider than the side window, big enough for both of them if she could just. She hooked her arms tighter around Theodore's chest and lunged backward through the shattered windshield, dragging him with her. Glass cascaded around them, glittering in the firelight that was now visible even through the smoke. They tumbled onto the wet trunk, then rolled off onto the pavement. Naomi didn't stop. She couldn't. The fire was real now, flames visible through the windows. She grabbed Theodore under his arms again and hauled him away from the car, her back screaming, her hand slipping on his blood-soaked shirt, her sneakers fighting for purchase on the slick ground. 20 feet. 30. 40. The Mercedes exploded. The shockwave knocked Naomi forward, and she threw her body over Theodore's, shielding him from the wave of heat and flying debris. She felt something hot slice across her back, felt the world turn orange and roaring, felt the pavement scrape her cheek as she pressed herself flat, holding onto this stranger like he was the only solid thing in a universe trying to shake itself apart. And then, through the ringing in her ears and the crackling of flames, she heard sirens. The emergency room at Oregon Health and Science University smelled like antiseptic and burnt coffee, a combination that made Naomi's already queasy stomach threaten rebellion. She sat in a plastic chair in the waiting area, a thin hospital blanket wrapped around her shoulders, watching the organized chaos of a Friday night ER through exhausted eyes. A nurse had cleaned and bandaged the cuts on her arms and back, 12 stitches total, she'd been told, along with a lecture about tetanus shots and wound care that Naomi had barely heard. The adrenaline that had carried her through pulling a stranger from a burning car had crashed hard, leaving her shaky and hollow. She should leave. She'd given her statement to the police, confirmed she didn't need to be admitted, signed the papers acknowledging she'd refused additional observation. She had to be at the diner in 6 hours for the breakfast shift. Her rent was still due. Her life, paused for this surreal interlude, was waiting to resume its grinding routine. But she couldn't make her legs cooperate. Every time she tried to stand, she saw that pale hand pressed against the window, heard the sound of metal crumpling, felt the heat of flames at her back. Ms. Wright. Naomi looked up to find a doctor standing in front of her, a tired-looking woman in her 50s with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a neat bun. "That's me," Naomi said, her voice hoarse from smoke inhalation. "I'm Dr. Patricia Hall. I've been treating Theodore Whitmore, the young man you pulled from the vehicle." The doctor sat down in the chair next to Naomi, her movements deliberate and careful. "I wanted to update you personally. He's stable. Concussion, 3 broken ribs, a fractured collarbone, significant lacerations, and some internal bruising. But he's alive. And he's conscious." The relief that washed through Naomi was so intense it made her dizzy. "He's going to be okay. Thanks to you." Dr. Hall's expression was serious. "The fire investigator said the car's fuel tank exploded less than 15 seconds after you got him clear. If you'd hesitated even a moment longer." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Naomi nodded, not trusting her voice. "He's been asking for you," Dr. Hall continued. "His family arrived about 20 minutes ago, and they're with him now. But he was quite insistent that he needed to thank you. Would you be willing to see him? I promise I won't keep you long. I know you've refused admission, which means you're free to leave whenever you choose." Every instinct Naomi had cultivated over 3 years of survival screamed at her to decline. Rich people and poor people didn't mix. Not really. Not in any way that ended well for the poor person. She'd learned that lesson the hard way, watching the friends from her old life, the one before her parents died, before poverty, drift away when she could no longer afford to keep up appearances. But she found herself nodding anyway. "Okay. Just for a minute." Dr. Hall led her through the controlled chaos to a private room at the far end of the hall, the kind of room that didn't exist for regular patients, the kind that money and influence secured even in a crowded emergency department. She knocked once, then opened the door. The room was larger than Naomi's apartment, with actual furniture instead of just medical equipment, and a window that looked out over the Portland skyline. Theodore Whitmore lay in the hospital bed, his head bandaged, his torso wrapped, and four running into his left arm. But his eyes were clear and focused as they found her in the doorway. And standing around his bed, like sentinels guarding royalty, were three people who made Naomi's breath catch. The woman closest to Theodore had to be his mother. Same blonde hair, same refined bone structure, though hers was styled in an elegant twist and her face was etched with worry beneath expertly applied makeup. She wore a cream-colored suit that probably cost more than Naomi's annual salary, and diamonds glittered at her ears and throat. The man near the window was older, 60 perhaps, with steel-grey hair and Theodore's eyes, though his were harder, sharper, the eyes of someone who'd built an empire and crushed anyone who stood in his way. His suit was impeccable despite the late hour, his posture rigid with control barely maintained. And standing between them was a younger woman, early 30s, with sharp cheekbones and auburn hair, wearing slacks and a blazer that screamed expensive lawyer or corporate executive. Her eyes swept over Naomi with an assessment that felt clinical, calculating. "You're the girl," the older man said, his voice deep and commanding. "Not a question. A statement." "I'm Naomi Wright," she said, lifting her chin despite feeling like she'd wandered onto a stage where she didn't know the lines. "I was just checking to see if Theodore was okay. I can leave if..." "No." Theodore's voice was rough but firm. He shifted in the bed, wincing. "Please stay. Mom, Dad, this is the woman who saved my life. Naomi, these are my parents, Catherine and Richard Whitmore. And my sister, Victoria." Catherine moved first, crossing the room with surprising speed to grasp Naomi's hands in hers. "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking on the words. "Thank you for saving my son. I can't." Tears spilled down her cheeks, carrying mascara with them, and for a moment the Polish cracked to reveal a mother who'd come terrifyingly close to burying her child. "I just did what anyone would do," Naomi said, uncomfortable with the gratitude, with the intensity of emotion in this too expensive room. "That's not true." Richard Whitmore spoke from his position by the window, and when Naomi looked at him, she saw something complicated in his expression. Gratitude, yes, but also something else. Calculation. "The police report says there were at least a dozen people in the vicinity. You were the only one who ran toward the danger instead of away from it." "The only one foolish enough, you mean," Victoria said, her voice cool and measured. But her eyes, when they met Naomi's, held something that might have been respect. "Though in this case, we're grateful for that particular brand of foolishness." Theodore made a frustrated sound. "Can everyone stop talking about her like she's not standing right here?" He looked directly at Naomi, and she was struck by how young he looked beneath the bandages, how vulnerable. "I remember bits and pieces. You came through the window. You got me out. The car exploded." He paused, his voice dropping. "You could have died." "But I didn't," Naomi said simply. "And neither did you. So it worked out." "Just like that?" Theodore asked. "You risk your life for a stranger, get injured in the process, and it worked out is all you have to say." Naomi shrugged, immediately regretting it as a stitched back protested. "What do you want me to say? That I'm a hero? I'm not. I'm just someone who was in the right place at the right time and didn't overthink it." "Most people overthink it," Richard said. "Most people perform a cost-benefit analysis, consciously or unconsciously, and decide the risk outweighs the potential gain. Especially when the person in danger is a stranger. Especially when that stranger is..." He gestured vaguely at the room, at his suit, at the visible markers of wealth. Obviously from a different world. There it was. The acknowledgement of the chasm between them, spoken aloud in a way that made Naomi's spine stiffen. "I didn't stop to check his tax bracket before I pulled him out," Naomi said, her voice cooler now. "Fire doesn't care how much money you have. Neither did I." A moment of surprised silence filled the room. Then Theodore laughed, a sharp, pained sound that made him wince and clutch his ribs. "I like her." "Theo, don't move so much," Catherine fretted, moving back to her son's bedside. "Ms. Wright," Richard said, and his voice had shifted into something that sounded like a business negotiation. "My son is alive because of you. That's a debt that cannot be adequately repaid, but I'd like to try. Whatever you need, medical bills from tonight, compensation for your time, a reward for your bravery, name it." This was the moment Naomi had been unconsciously dreading. The moment where her poverty became currency, where what she needed could be measured and transacted. She thought about the rent she couldn't pay, the electricity bill, the student loans in default, the grinding daily calculation of survival. She thought about how easy it would be to say yes. To take whatever check Richard Whitmore would write, and it would be a check, substantial and life-changing. To let this one act of impulse solve the problems that had been slowly drowning her for 3 years. But she'd learned, in the hardest ways possible, that money from people like this always came with strings. Invisible at first, maybe, but there. And she'd fought too hard to maintain what little autonomy she had to surrender it now. "I don't want anything," Naomi said firmly. "I'm glad he's okay. That's enough." Richard's eyebrows rose. "Ms. Wright, I don't think you understand." "I understand perfectly," Naomi interrupted, fatigue making her bold. "You're a wealthy family. You think gratitude equals transaction. But I didn't do it for money, and I don't want to be paid for it. So thank you for the offer, but no." Victoria made a small sound that might have been a laugh. Catherine looked shocked. Theodore was watching Naomi with an expression she couldn't quite read. Surprise, certainly, but something else too. Something like recognition. "At least let us cover your medical expenses from tonight," Catherine said. "Please. That's not charity. That's just basic decency. You were injured helping our son." Naomi hesitated. That was different, wasn't it? Not a reward, just covering the cost of consequences that were directly related to the rescue. "Okay," she said finally. "The medical bills. But that's it." "Fair enough," Richard said, though his tone suggested he thought it was anything but fair. "Though if you change your mind." "I won't." Another silence, this one awkward. Naomi realized she was still standing just inside the doorway, still wrapped in the hospital blanket, still bleeding through the bandages on her back if the faint sting was any indication. She needed to leave, to get home, to maybe process what had just happened in the solitude of her tiny room. "I should go," she said. "I'm glad you're okay, Theodore. Take care of yourself." She turned to leave, but Theodore's voice stopped her. "Wait. Naomi, can I call you Naomi?" She looked back. "Sure." "Why did you do it?" he asked, and there was genuine curiosity in his eyes. "Really? You saw the car, the fire. You heard the 911 operator tell you to get away. But you came anyway. Why?" Naomi considered the question. This young man in his hospital bed who'd probably never had to fight for anything in his life, who'd grown up in a world of safety nets and second chances, who couldn't possibly understand what it meant to live on the knife's edge of survival. But his eyes were earnest, and he'd almost died, and maybe he deserved an honest answer. "Because I know what it's like to feel helpless," she said quietly. "To need help and have everyone walk by because stopping would be inconvenient. And I promised myself that if I ever had the chance to be the person who stopped, I would. Even if it was scary. Even if it was stupid. Especially then." Theodore's expression shifted, something vulnerable moving behind his eyes. "Thank you," he said, and this time it sounded different. Not like gratitude for a transaction, but like recognition of a gift freely given. Naomi nodded. Then, before the moment could become any more uncomfortable, before she could start crying or saying things she'd regret, she walked out of the room. She made it halfway down the hall before Victoria caught up with her. "Ms. Wright, Naomi. Wait." Naomi stopped, turning warily. Up close, Victoria Whitmore was even more intimidating, tall, poised, with an air of competence that came from years of navigating rooms full of powerful people. "I wanted to give you this," Victoria said, holding out a business card. "It has my personal number and email. If you need anything, and I mean anything, please don't hesitate to reach out." "I already said I don't want." "I know what you said," Victoria interrupted smoothly. "And I respect it. This isn't about money or repayment. This is about—" She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "My little brother can be reckless. Thoughtless, even. He drives too fast, takes too many risks, thinks he's invincible because our father's money has always caught him before he could fall. Tonight, he learned differently. And you're the reason he's alive to learn that lesson." She pressed the card into Naomi's hand. "I'm a corporate attorney. I have resources, connections. If you ever need help, legal trouble, employment issues, anything, Call me. No strings. Just, one woman to another, understanding that the world isn't always fair and sometimes we need to look out for each other. Naomi looked down at the card. Victoria Whitmore, Senior Partner, Whitmore and Associates. An office address in downtown Portland that put it in one of the expensive high-rises with views of the Willamette. Okay, Naomi said, tucking the card into her pocket. Not because she'd ever use it, but because refusing felt like it would lead to more conversation, and she was so tired she could barely stand. One more thing, Victoria said. What you did tonight, running toward danger to help someone, that takes a particular kind of person. The kind who sees injustice and acts, who sees need and responds. The world needs more people like that. Don't let it grind you down into someone who walks by. Before Naomi could respond, Victoria turned and walked back toward her brother's room, her heels clicking efficiently against the linoleum. Naomi stood there for a moment, Victoria's words echoing in her exhausted mind. Then she returned the hospital blanket to a nurse's station, declined the offered wheelchair, and walked out into the pre-dawn Portland rain. She had 3 hours before her shift started. Just enough time to walk home. She couldn't afford an Uber, change clothes, and pretend tonight had never happened. Except it had happened. And as Naomi walked through the empty streets, past the sleeping homeless encampments and the closed storefronts, past the world that didn't stop for anyone's drama or trauma or near-death experiences, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. She'd spent 3 years trying to be invisible, to take up as little space as possible, to survive without drawing attention. Tonight, she'd been the opposite of invisible. She'd acted, chosen, saved. And for just a moment, standing in that expensive hospital room with people who lived in a completely different reality, she'd felt like more than just someone struggling to survive. She'd felt like someone who mattered. The rain soaked through her jacket, the same jacket she'd wrapped around her arm to break into a burning car. It was ruined now, torn and stained with blood and soot. She'd have to find a new one somehow, add it to the growing list of things she needed but couldn't afford. But Theodore Whitmore was alive. And somehow, despite everything, that felt worth it. 3 days later, Naomi was wiping down tables during the lunch rush at Rose's Diner when the Mercedes pulled up outside. Not the destroyed one from the accident, a different Mercedes, sleek and black and obviously expensive, the kind that made other cars on Morrison Street look like they'd given up on life. The lunch crowd barely noticed. Rose's attracted a mix of regulars, construction workers, retired folks on fixed incomes, artists from the nearby studios who could afford the $8.99 lunch special but not much else. A luxury car was just background noise, something from another world that occasionally drifted through on the way to somewhere more important. But Naomi noticed. She'd been jumpy for 3 days, startling at sudden sounds, seeing fire in her dreams. The cuts on her back were healing but still tender, making it hard to sleep in her usual position. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt heat at her back and smelled burning gasoline. The driver's side door opened, and Theodore Whitmore stepped out. He moved carefully, obviously still in pain, one arm held stiffly against his ribs. The bandage on his forehead had been replaced with a smaller one, and he traded the expensive suit for jeans and a dark blue sweater that probably cost more than her monthly rent. Even injured and dressed down, he looked like he'd stepped out of a catalog advertising a lifestyle she'd never access. Naomi ducked into the kitchen before he could spot her through the window. "Hey, Rosie, can you take my tables for a few minutes? I need to." "That the boy from the news?" Rosie asked, not looking up from the grill where she was flipping burgers. At Naomi's surprised look, she laughed. "Baby girl, you think I don't watch TV? Local woman saves billionaire's son. You made CNN." Naomi's stomach dropped. "What? Someone got it on their phone. You dragging him away from the car right before it exploded. Very dramatic. Very heroic." Rosie flipped a burger with practiced ease. "Also very stupid, but we've already had that conversation." "Rosie." "Go talk to him," Rosie said, her tone brooking no argument. "Running and hiding never solved anything. Besides, he looks like he's going to come in here whether you greet him or not, and I don't need rich boys disrupting my lunch rush." As if on cue, the diner's bell chimed as the door opened. Naomi took a deep breath, wiped her hands on her apron, and pushed through the kitchen door. Theodore stood just inside the entrance, looking completely out of place among the cracked vinyl booths and the faded photos of Portland from the 1970s that decorated the walls. He spotted her immediately, and relief flashed across his face. Naomi. Hi. I wasn't sure you'd be here, but, he gestured vaguely at the diner. The hospital had your employment information from the intake forms, and I thought. You thought you'd just show up at my workplace. Naomi kept her voice level, professional. Several of the regulars were watching now, curious about the drama unfolding. I called, Theodore said. Twice. But the number on file was disconnected. Because Naomi had let her phone service lapse to make rent. But she wasn't about to tell him that. What do you want, Theodore? To thank you properly, he said. And to apologize. That caught her off guard. Apologize for what? For my father. Theodore's jaw tightened. The way he treated you at the hospital, like your heroism was a transaction he could close with a check. That wasn't right. You deserved better. A timer went off in the kitchen. Someone called out an order. The world kept spinning, indifferent to this conversation happening in the doorway of a diner that had been serving mediocre coffee and excellent pie since 1983. Okay, Naomi said. Apology accepted. Thank you for coming by. I hope you're healing well. Have coffee with me, Theodore blurted out. Please. Just 30 minutes. I need to, there are things I want to say, to ask, and I can't do it properly while you're working and people are staring. Naomi was acutely aware of exactly how many people were staring. Mrs. Chen from the laundromat upstairs. Marcus, the construction foreman who came in every day for the meatloaf special. Even Rosie had emerged from the kitchen, standing with her arms crossed and an expression that clearly said, handle this. I'm working until 6, Naomi said. Then dinner. My treat. Anywhere you want. No. The word came out sharper than she intended. I mean, thank you, but no. I don't need you to buy me dinner. I don't need anything from you. Something flickered in Theodore's eyes. Hurt, maybe, or frustration. It's not about need. It's about. He ran a hand through his hair, wincing as the movement pulled at his ribs. Look, you saved my life. That's not nothing. And I can't stop thinking about what you said, about being the person who stops. About not walking by. I need to understand. Understand what? Naomi asked. That poor people sometimes do decent things? That we're not all grasping and desperate and willing to sell our morals for a check? The diner had gone quiet. Even the clatter from the kitchen had stopped. Theodore's face flushed. That's not what I meant. Isn't it? Naomi was aware she was being unfair, taking out 3 years of frustration and resentment on someone who'd nearly died. But she couldn't seem to stop. You come to my workplace in your expensive car, interrupt my shift, want to take me somewhere nice for dinner so you can feel better about the fact that someone from my world saved someone from yours. Well, congratulations. You've thanked me. Your conscience is clear. You can go back to your life now. It's not about my conscience, Theodore said, and now there was heat in his voice too. It's about the fact that you did something extraordinary, and I can't just ignore it. I can't just go back to my life and pretend it didn't happen. Why not? Naomi demanded. That's what everyone else does. That's what your father did, tried to write a check and make it go away. Why can't you? Because you didn't let him. Theodore's voice rose, and several diners actually jumped. He took a breath, visibly calming himself. You stood in that hospital room and told one of the most powerful men in Portland that you didn't want his money. Do you have any idea how rare that is? How many people would have taken whatever he offered and run? Most people aren't desperate enough to see strings where you see generosity, Naomi shot back. And maybe that's why I'm here, Theodore said quietly. Maybe I need to understand what that desperation looks like. What it means to live in a world where help always comes with strings. Because you're right, I don't know. I've never had to know. And that ignorance almost killed me. Naomi blinked. That wasn't what she'd expected him to say. The accident, Theodore continued. I was racing away from an argument with my father. About responsibility, about the family business, about growing up and taking my place in the empire, his built. I was angry and reckless, and I didn't care about wet roads or speed limits or the fact that I was putting other people at risk. Because I've never had to care. And then you appeared, this woman who had every reason to keep walking, who probably can't afford to miss a single shift, who risked everything for someone who's never had to risk anything. and it made me realize how small my world is. How insulated. How wrong. He took a step closer, his gray eyes intense. So yes, I want to have coffee with you. Or dinner. Or whatever you're comfortable with. Not to assuage my guilt or congratulate myself on knowing a hero. But because for the first time in my life, I met someone who acts according to principles instead of profit margins, and I need to understand how that's possible. I need to know if I can learn to be more like that. The diner was so quiet Naomi could hear the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. My shift ends at 6, she said finally. There's a coffee shop on 42nd, the Daily Grind. I'll meet you there at 6:30. But I'm buying my own coffee. Theodore's face lit up with a smile that transformed him from wealthy playboy to something younger, more genuine. Deal. Thank you, Naomi. He turned to leave, then paused. And Naomi? For what it's worth, I don't think you're desperate or grasping. I think you're one of the strongest people I've ever met. Then he was gone, the bell chiming behind him, the Mercedes pulling away into Portland traffic. Naomi stood there for a long moment, aware of every eye on her, every unspoken question hanging in the air. Finally, Rosie broke the silence. Well, she said, her voice carrying across the diner. Show's over, folks. Let the girl get back to work. The normal sounds of the diner resumed, conversations, clinking silverware, the hiss of the grill. But as Naomi returned to wiping down tables, she felt Mrs. Chen pat her shoulder in passing, heard Marcus mutter "good for you, kid," under his breath. And in her pocket, Victoria Whitmore's business card felt heavier than it had 3 days ago. The Daily Grind occupied a converted house on 42nd, the kind of Portland coffee shop that prided itself on locally roasted beans, mismatched furniture, and a vibe that was more community center than commercial enterprise. Naomi had been coming here for 2 years, back when she could afford to spend $3 on a drip coffee and pretend she was still a college student with a future instead of a dropout with debts. She arrived at 6:25, early despite herself, and ordered her usual, black coffee, the smallest size, nothing fancy. She found a table in the back corner, away from the window, where she could watch the door without being too visible from the street. Theodore arrived exactly at 6:30, looking far less composed than he had at the diner. His sweater was slightly rumpled, and he'd clearly been running his hands through his hair enough times to give up on any pretense of style. He spotted her, smiled that same genuine smile from earlier, and made his way to the counter. 5 minutes later, he sat down across from her with what looked like a complicated espresso drink topped with foam art. So, he said, wrapping his hands around the cup like he needed the warmth. Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would. I almost didn't, Naomi admitted. I'm still not sure why I did. Curiosity. Maybe. She took a sip of her coffee, using the time to study him. Without his family around, without the trappings of wealth and the pressure of the hospital, he looked different. Younger. More uncertain. You said you wanted to understand. Understand what, exactly? Theodore was quiet for a moment, staring into his drink. How you did it, he said finally. Not the physical part, climbing through a window, dragging me out. But the decision part. The part where you saw danger and ran toward it instead of away. I already told you why. You gave me the philosophical answer, Theodore countered. The big picture. But I want to understand the specific moment. What were you thinking? Were you scared? Terrified, Naomi said without hesitation. I could smell the gasoline. I could see smoke. Every rational thought in my head was screaming to run away. But you didn't. No. Why? Naomi set down her coffee cup, considering how much truth to offer. She'd spent 3 years learning to keep her truths close, to not give ammunition to people who might use her vulnerability against her. But Theodore was watching her with genuine curiosity, no judgment in his eyes, and maybe it was exhaustion or maybe it was the fact that she pulled him from a burning car and that created a kind of intimacy that normal social rules didn't quite cover. Because walking away would have meant living with the image of your hand on that window for the rest of my life, she said. Because I've been in situations where I needed help and nobody came. Because when you've lost everything, you realize that the only thing you really have is the person you choose to be in the moment when it matters. And I didn't want to be the person who walked away. Theodore absorbed that in silence. Outside, Portland's evening traffic rolled by, cars heading home to warm houses, to families, to lives that hummed along in comfortable rhythms. Naomi watched them and felt the familiar ache of being outside looking in, of existing in parallel to a world she couldn't quite access. "Tell me about the people you needed who didn't come," Theodore said quietly. "That's not why we're here. Isn't it?" He leaned forward. "You said you understand desperation, strings, what it's like when help doesn't come. I'm trying to understand that world. The one I've never had to live in. So tell me." Naomi wanted to refuse. But there was something in his expression, an openness, a willingness to be uncomfortable, that reminded her of why she'd agreed to this meeting in the first place. "My parents died in a house fire when I was 19, she said, the words coming out flat, recited. "Electrical fault. Old wiring in a rental house the landlord had been warned to fix. They died. I survived because I was at a friend's house. The insurance barely covered the funeral. I had a partial scholarship to Portland State, but it didn't cover housing, and I had no money, no family, no safety net. I tried to keep going, worked 2 jobs, slept in my car when I couldn't afford rent, showered at the gym. But you can't study for finals when you're exhausted and hungry and terrified. I failed out. Lost the scholarship. Defaulted on the student loans I'd taken to cover what the scholarship didn't." She took a breath, aware she was reciting facts like a police report, keeping the emotions locked away where they couldn't hurt. "I've been homeless twice. Lived in my car until it got repossessed. Slept in shelters that were more dangerous than the streets. Applied for hundreds of jobs and got rejected because I don't have an address that looks stable, because I have gaps in my employment history, because I'm black and female and not quite the right fit. Right now, I'm 3 weeks behind on rent for a room above a laundromat. I work 45 hours a week at a diner where I make $15 an hour plus tips, and it's still not enough to get ahead. It's barely enough to not fall further behind." She met his eyes, daring him to look away, to offer platitudes or pity. That's what desperation looks like. That's what it means to live in a world where help is theoretical, where one bad day, one medical emergency, one car breaking down can cascade into homelessness and debt and a future that keeps shrinking. "So, when your father offered me money, all I could think was, what will this cost me? Because in my world, nothing is free. There's always a cost." Theodore's expression had shifted throughout her recitation, from curiosity to shock to something that looked like grief. "I'm sorry," he said, and his voice was rough. "I had no idea." "Of course you didn't," Naomi said, but without heat. "Why would you? People like you and people like me, we exist in the same physical space but completely different realities. You drive past us, the waitresses, the janitors, the people working 3 jobs to survive, and we're invisible. Background noise. And that's fine. That's how the world works. But don't act surprised when we don't trust your generosity. When we see the strings, you don't even realize you're attaching." "What strings?" Theodore asked. "My father offered you money. No conditions. Just gratitude." Naomi laughed, sharp and bitter. "There are always conditions. Maybe not spoken ones, but implied. The expectation that I'll be grateful, deferential, that I'll fit into the story you want to tell yourself about how generous and benevolent you are. The understanding that you hold the power, that you're the giver and I'm the recipient, and that dynamic defines our interaction forever. The knowledge that if I accept, I become the poor girl you helped, the charity case, the proof of your good character. And if I ever step out of that role, if I ever challenge you or disagree or just want to be seen as an equal instead of an object of pity, then I'm ungrateful. Difficult. Not worth helping after all." She leaned back, suddenly exhausted. "So yes, there are strings. And I learned a long time ago that it's better to struggle alone than to get tangled up in someone else's narrative of who I should be." Theodore was quiet for a long time, processing. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful. What if someone wanted to help without any narrative? Without strings or expectations or power dynamics? Is that possible? "In theory, maybe," Naomi said. "In practice? I've never seen it." "Then let me be the first." Theodore pulled out his phone, tapped a few times, then slid it across the table. On the screen was a Venmo transaction, ready to be sent. The amount made Naomi's breath catch, $5,000. "I don't want." "It's not charity," Theodore interrupted. "It's payment. The news story, the one Rosie mentioned, my family's PR team pushed it. They made you part of our narrative without asking your permission. They used your image, your story, to make us look good. That's worth compensation. He pushed the phone closer. $5,000. No strings. No expectations. You never have to see me again after tonight if you don't want to. You can use it for rent, for bills, for whatever you need. Or you can refuse it and prove that I'm just another rich guy who thinks everything can be solved with money. Your choice. Naomi stared at the phone. $5,000. 3 months of rent. Her electricity bill. Her phone turned back on. New shoes. A buffer against the next disaster. The breathing room to maybe, possibly, think about something beyond just surviving. But accepting meant, what? That Theodore was right? That she could be bought after all, just at a higher price than his father offered? Or that sometimes, practicality had to outweigh pride, and there was no nobility in refusing help when you were drowning? What would you do if someone tried to help you, but you weren't sure if you could trust their intentions? Sometimes the hardest thing to accept is kindness when you've learned to survive without it. Why are you really doing this? Naomi asked, not touching the phone. And don't tell me it's about the PR story. You could have had your lawyers send a check. You didn't have to come here, to my workplace, to this coffee shop. You didn't have to ask me about my life or listen to me explain poverty like you're a student taking notes. So, what do you actually want? Theodore withdrew the phone slowly, setting it face down on the table between them. Honestly, I don't entirely know. He ran his hand through his hair again, that nervous gesture that made him look younger. 3 days ago, I was driving too fast, angry at my father, convinced that my biggest problem was whether to take over the family business or disappoint everyone by pursuing something I actually cared about. Then I woke up in a hospital bed, alive because a stranger risked her life for me. A stranger who had every reason not to. He leaned forward, his grey eyes intense. And I can't stop thinking, what kind of person does that? What kind of person sees a burning car and runs toward it? What kind of person tells a billionaire no to his face? What kind of strength does that take? And why don't I have it? You were unconscious, Naomi pointed out. Kind of hard to demonstrate strength when you're concussed and trapped. I'm not talking about physical strength, Theodore said. I'm talking about moral courage. Principle. The ability to act according to your values even when it's terrifying or inconvenient or might cost you something. You have that. I don't think I do. I think I've spent 25 years taking the path of least resistance, letting my family's money and influence smooth away any obstacle, never having to choose between what's right and what's easy because for me, they've always been the same thing. He looked down at his hands. When I was in that car, trapped and fading, I had this moment of absolute clarity. I thought, I'm going to die, and what have I done? What mark have I left? What have I contributed to the world besides taking up space and spending money I didn't earn? And the answer was nothing. I've done nothing that matters. I've been nothing that matters. That's survivor's guilt talking, Naomi said, though her voice was gentler now. Near-death experiences mess with your head. Give it a few weeks. You'll feel better. Maybe, Theodore said. Or maybe this is the first time I'm seeing clearly. You asked why I'm here. The truth is, I want to understand how to be someone worth saving. Someone who does things that matter. And you seem like you might know how. Naomi sat back, stunned. Of all the things she'd expected, guilt, gratitude, curiosity, even attraction, this philosophical crisis hadn't been on the list. I don't have those answers, she said finally. I'm not some enlightened guru who's figured out the meaning of life. I'm just trying to survive. But you do it with integrity, Theodore pressed. Even when it would be easier not to. Even when accepting help would solve your immediate problems, you refuse because you don't want to compromise your principles. That's not just survival, that's choosing who you are. Or it's stupid pride that's going to land me homeless again, Naomi countered. You're romanticizing my situation. Poverty isn't noble. It's grinding and dehumanizing, and it makes you desperate in ways that have nothing to do with moral courage. I didn't refuse your father's money because I'm some principled hero. I refused it because I've been burned before by people who offer help and then use it as leverage. That's not integrity, that's self-preservation. Can't it be both? Naomi opened her mouth to argue, then stopped. Could it be both? Was it possible that her hard-learned wariness and her desire to maintain autonomy were two sides of the same coin? That surviving with her dignity intact was itself a form of resistance against a system designed to grind her down? She'd never thought about it that way before. I don't know, she admitted. Maybe. Theodore picked up his phone again, but instead of sliding it across the table, he opened a different app, his banking app, from what Naomi could see. I want to make you an offer. A real one, with full transparency about what I'm asking for in return. I'm listening. Take the $5,000, he said. Use it for whatever you need, rent, bills, breathing room. In exchange, have dinner with me once a week for the next 2 months. No expensive restaurants unless you choose them. No PR opportunities. No photos or publicity. Just dinner and conversation. Let me learn from you what it means to navigate the world without a safety net. Let me understand the reality you live in. Help me figure out how to be someone who uses my privilege for something meaningful instead of just insulating myself from consequences. He met her eyes. That's the string. Your time and your honesty. 8 dinners over 2 months. After that, we're even, and you never have to see me again if you don't want to. But at least I'll have learned something real instead of just writing a check and calling it charity. Naomi's mind raced through the implications. 8 dinners. 8 conversations. 2 months of letting Theodore Whitmore into her world, seeing her life, asking questions that would probably be uncomfortable and invasive and well-meaning in that way privileged people were when they wanted to understand poverty without actually experiencing it. But also, $5,000. 3 months of rent. Her phone reconnected. Her debts paid down. The space to maybe, finally, stop treading water and actually move forward. What if I take your money and then ghost you after the first dinner? She asked. What's to stop me? Theodore smiled slightly. Nothing. I'd be disappointed, but nothing. I'm not going to draw up a contract or demand collateral. This only works if you choose it freely. If it feels like obligation or coercion, then I'm just another rich guy using money to control people, and we're both wasting our time. You're serious. Completely. Naomi looked at the phone on the table, at Theodore's earnest expression, at the coffee shop around them where people were studying and working and living their normal lives, oblivious to this strange negotiation happening in the corner. She thought about her rent, due in 5 days. About the electricity bill. About the collection calls she'd been ignoring. About the constant, grinding anxiety of never having enough, of always being one disaster away from losing everything. She thought about Theodore's question. What kind of person does that? What kind of strength does that take? And she thought, maybe the kind who's willing to be uncomfortable in exchange for survival. Maybe the kind who can accept help even when she's not sure it's wise. Maybe the kind who's done being so afraid of strings that she can't even grab a lifeline when it's offered. Okay, she said. 8 dinners. 2 months. Full honesty about what my life actually looks like, even when it's uncomfortable or makes you feel guilty or challenges your assumptions about how the world works. Deal, Theodore said immediately. He tapped his phone, and a moment later, Naomi's phone buzzed in her pocket, the cracked iPhone she'd let the service lapse on, but which still connected to Wi-Fi. She pulled it out and saw the notification. Theodore Whitmore sent you $5,000. Her hands shook slightly as she held the phone. $5,000. Just like that. She could accept it right now, with one tap, and her immediate problems would be solved. Or she could decline. Walk away. Maintain her pride and her independence and her perfect record of never owing anyone anything. Her finger hovered over the accept button. For what it's worth, Theodore said quietly, I don't think this makes you less strong or independent. I think it makes you smart enough to recognize when an opportunity is genuine and brave enough to take it even when you're scared. That's its own kind of courage. Naomi looked up at him. You're good at saying the right thing. I've had a lot of practice manipulating people, Theodore admitted. Privilege isn't just about money. It's about learning to navigate social situations to get what you want. But I'm trying to be different with you. To be honest. Because I think you'd see through anything else immediately. I would, Naomi agreed. Then she tapped accept. The money transferred instantly. $5,000, appearing in her account like magic, like a prayer answered, like a temporary reprieve from the constant battle of survival. Naomi let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Okay. First dinner is officially complete. 7 more to go. Theodore laughed, a real laugh, surprised and delighted. I don't think coffee shops count as dinner. Then you're buying me actual food, Naomi said. Nothing fancy. There's a Thai place on Division that has a $12 pad Thai that'll change your life. Tomorrow night. I work until 8. 8:30 then. I'll pick you up at the diner. They finished their coffee in more comfortable silence, the awkwardness of negotiation giving way to something that almost felt like friendship. When they stood to leave, Theodore walked her to the door, and Naomi was acutely aware of the difference in their worlds. His expensive car waiting somewhere nearby, her walk home through darkening streets to a room above a laundromat. But for the first time in 3 years, she had a buffer. $5,000 wouldn't solve everything. It wouldn't erase her student loans or give her a career or undo the trauma of poverty. But it would give her time. Space. The ability to breathe without the constant panic of immediate disaster. Thank you, she said at the door, for being weird and persistent and honest about what you wanted. It made it easier to say yes. Thank you for giving me a chance, Theodore replied. And for saving my life. I know I keep saying it, but I don't think I'll ever be able to say it enough times. 7 more dinners, Naomi reminded him. You'll have plenty of opportunities. She walked home through the Portland evening, past the homeless encampments and the struggling businesses and the street art that decorated buildings the city had forgotten. Her phone buzzed constantly as she walked, payment confirmations, bank notifications, the digital evidence of a transaction that had just changed her immediate future. When she got home, she sat on her narrow bed and cried, from relief, from exhaustion, from the sheer overwhelming weight of having caught a break after 3 years of nothing but obstacles and setbacks and grinding difficulty. Then she wiped her eyes, opened her banking app, and started making a list. Rent, first priority. Electricity, second. Phone service, third. After that, she'd figure it out. She had time now. Not much, but some. And she had 7 more dinners with a billionaire's son who thought she had something to teach him about courage. Maybe she did. Or maybe she'd figure it out along the way. Either way, for the first time in longer than she could remember, Naomi Wright felt something that wasn't quite hope but was close enough, possibility. The 7th dinner happened on a cold December evening at a food cart pod in southeast Portland. The kind of place where 5 different cuisines competed for attention under covered pavilion, where picnic tables bore the carved initials of 1,000 temporary visitors, where the boundary between different worlds felt more permeable. 6 weeks had passed since that first coffee at the Daily Grind. 6 weeks of dinners where Theodore asked questions and Naomi answered with increasing honesty. 6 weeks where she'd shown him her world, not the sanitized, comfortable version, but the real one. They'd eaten at the diner where she worked, and he'd watched her navigate the constant demands of entitled customers and inadequate tips. They'd walked through Old Town, past the people sleeping in doorways, and she'd explained why just get a job wasn't a solution when you had no address, no clean clothes, no place to shower. They'd sat in her tiny room above the laundromat, and he'd seen exactly how small a space $500 a month bought in a city with a housing crisis. And something had shifted between them. What started as a transaction, money for insight, tutoring in poverty for a privileged student, had become something more complicated. Friendship, maybe, or recognition. The understanding that despite their vastly different circumstances, they were both trying to figure out who they wanted to be. Theodore had changed in those 6 weeks. The entitled recklessness Naomi had glimpsed in their first conversations had been replaced by something more thoughtful, more aware. He'd started volunteering at a homeless shelter downtown, not for publicity but because he wanted to understand the systems that failed people. He'd had arguments with his father about the Whitmore family's business practices, arguments he shared with Naomi over their dinners, seeking her perspective on labor practices and living wages and whether wealth could ever be truly ethical. And Naomi had changed too. The $5,000 had given her breathing room, yes, but more than that, these dinners had given her something she hadn't realized she'd lost, the ability to think beyond survival. To imagine a future that included growth instead of just grinding persistence. She'd started taking an online course in social work, something she could do on her phone during slow shifts at the diner. Started thinking about maybe, someday, being the person who showed up for others the way no one had shown up for her. So, this is the last one, Theodore said, sitting across from her with a plate of Korean barbecue tacos. The string lights overhead cast warm shadows across his face, and Naomi noticed, not for the first time, that he was handsome in a way that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with the earnestness in his eyes. Dinner number 7. After this, our deal is complete. Technically, we still have one more, Naomi pointed out, picking at her pad thai from the cart she'd recommended on their first official dinner. Right. The 8th dinner. The one that determines whether this whole thing was just a transaction or something more. Naomi looked up sharply. More. Theodore set down his taco, his expression serious. Naomi, over the past 6 weeks, you've changed my life. Not in some abstract, philosophical way. In concrete, measurable ways. I've learned more about the world, the real world, not the insulated bubble I grew up in, than I learned in 4 years of college. I've made decisions about my future based on conversations we've had. I've started trying to use my privilege for something meaningful instead of just coasting on it. And He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. I value your perspective. Your honesty. Your company. I don't want this to end just because we fulfilled the terms of our agreement. What are you saying? Naomi asked, though her heart was already racing with the implications. I'm saying I want there to be a dinner number 9. And 10. And as many as you're willing to have. Not because of money or obligation, but because I've come to care about you as a person. As a friend. And maybe. He stopped, met her eyes. Maybe as something more than that. Naomi's breath caught. She'd felt it too, the shift from transaction to connection, from teacher-student dynamic to something more equal, more mutual. The way her heart sped up when his name appeared on her phone. The way she found herself thinking about him during her shifts, wondering what he'd think about something she'd observed, eager to share it with him. But she'd told herself it was just gratitude. Just the natural warmth that came from someone genuinely listening, genuinely caring about her perspective. Not attraction. Not possibility. Because that path led to complications she couldn't afford, literal and metaphorical complications. Theodore. Before you answer, he interrupted gently, there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you weeks ago, but I was afraid it would change things between us, and I didn't want to lose what we were building. Naomi's stomach dropped. Here it was, the other shoe, the string she'd missed, the complication she'd been waiting for. My father wants to meet you, Theodore said. Officially. He's planning a charity gala in 2 weeks, the Whitmore Foundation's annual fundraiser. 500 guests, black tie, massive donations to various causes. And he wants to honor you publicly. Give you an award for heroism. Make a big show of the family's gratitude. No, Naomi said immediately. Absolutely not. I told him you'd say that, Theodore said. I've been putting him off for weeks, making excuses, trying to protect you from exactly this kind of thing. But he found out about our dinners. He has people who keep tabs on me, apparently, because that's not invasive or concerning, and now he's convinced that you're some kind of project of mine. That I'm being taken advantage of by a clever woman who rescued me specifically to get access to the family money. Naomi laughed, sharp and bitter. Of course he thinks that. Because in his world, nobody does anything without a profit motive. Exactly, Theodore said. And I've tried to explain that you're not like that our friendship is genuine, but he won't listen. So, he's engineered this situation. He's told me that if I don't bring you to the gala, if you don't accept the award and the public recognition, he's going to assume you have something to hide. That you're manipulating me. And he'll. Theodore's jaw tightened. He'll make things difficult for you. Not directly, he's too smart for that. But he has influence. He could make sure you don't find better employment. Could make sure landlords suddenly find reasons not to rent to you. Could make your life in Portland very complicated. The food in Naomi's stomach turned to lead. He'd do that? Ruin someone's life just because his son has a friend he doesn't approve of. He'd frame it as protecting me, Theodore said, his voice heavy with disgust. As doing what any father would do to keep his son safe from people who might exploit him. He doesn't see it as cruelty. He sees it as responsibility. And he's done it before, to other people he perceived as threats to the family. Naomi stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the concrete. Around them, other diners looked up briefly, then returned to their meals, accustomed to drama in public spaces. She walked to the edge of the pavilion, looking out at the dark street, trying to control the rage and fear swirling through her. Theodore followed, keeping a respectful distance. I'm sorry. I should have told you sooner. I kept thinking I could handle it, could manage my father, could keep you separate from all the family politics. But I was wrong. And now you're caught in something that's not your fault and not fair. Nothing about this has ever been fair, Naomi said, her voice low. That's the lesson your father doesn't get. He thinks he can control outcomes, manipulate situations, by solutions. And he can, because people like him have all the power and people like me have none. So yes, I'll go to his gala. I'll accept his award. I'll play the role he's cast me in, the grateful poor girl rescued by the benevolent rich family. Because the alternative is having my life destroyed, and I've worked too hard to survive to let that happen. Naomi. She turned to face him, and the hurt in her expression made Theodore flinch. Do you understand what you've done? For 6 weeks, I let myself believe this was real. That our friendship was genuine. That someone from your world actually saw me as an equal instead of a project or a threat or a charity case. But this whole time, your father's been watching. Investigating. Planning how to neutralize me if I turned out to be inconvenient. And you knew. You knew, and you didn't tell me. I was trying to protect you. You were protecting yourself. Naomi's voice rose, years of suppressed anger finally finding a target. You didn't want to lose your interesting experiment in poverty tourism. Your weekly dinners where you got to feel enlightened and evolved by spending time with a noble poor girl. So, you kept this secret. Let me think I was safe. Let me believe that maybe, just maybe, someone powerful actually gave a damn about me as a person instead of as a problem to be solved or a threat to be managed. That's not fair, Theodore said, his own frustration breaking through. Everything I've told you, everything we've shared, that was real. My respect for you, my friendship, my feelings. Those are real. My father's paranoia doesn't change that. It changes everything. Naomi shouted. Because your feelings don't protect me. Your respect doesn't pay my rent when your father decides to blacklist me from every employer in Portland. Your friendship is a luxury I can't afford if it comes with enemies like Richard Whitmore. She grabbed her jacket from the back of her chair. I'll go to your gala. I'll smile for the cameras. I'll say whatever your father wants me to say. And then we're done. Deal complete. No dinner number 8. No friendship. No complications. I go back to my world, you go back to yours, and we both pretend these 6 weeks never happened. Naomi, please. But she was already walking away, through the pavilion and into the dark Portland streets, her breath coming in angry gasps, tears burning in her eyes. Behind her, she heard Theodore call her name, but she didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Because if she stopped, if she let him explain or apologize or look at her with those earnest gray eyes, she might forgive him. Might convince herself that his feelings were worth the risk of his father's wrath. And she'd learned long ago that hope was the most dangerous luxury of all. The Whitmore Foundation Gala took place at the Portland Art Museum, a venue that had been transformed into something out of a fairy tale, all crystal chandeliers and ice sculptures and tables draped in white linen. Naomi stood in the bathroom off the main hall, staring at her reflection in the mirror, barely recognizing herself. Victoria Whitmore had arranged everything. The dress, a simple but elegant black gown that fit perfectly, probably cost more than Naomi made in 3 months, and made her feel like she was wearing someone else's skin. The shoes, heels that were surprisingly comfortable but still made her tower in a way that felt unnatural. The hair and makeup, done by professionals who descended on her apartment that afternoon, transforming her from exhausted waitress to someone who might believably belong in a room full of millionaires. You look beautiful, Victoria had said when the transformation was complete. But more importantly, you look like someone who belongs here. Someone who can't be dismissed or diminished. Remember that tonight. Naomi hadn't seen Theodore since their argument at the food cart pod 5 days ago. He'd texted, repeatedly, apologizing, explaining, begging for a chance to talk. She'd ignored every message, too angry and hurt and scared to engage. But she'd shown up tonight because Victoria had been right about one thing. Refusing would only make things worse. Better to endure one night of performance than months or years of subtle sabotage from a man who saw her as a threat to his son. A knock on the bathroom door made her jump. Naomi? It's Victoria. They're ready for you. Naomi took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and opened the door. Victoria stood in the hallway, elegant in a deep blue gown, her expression sympathetic. I know this isn't what you wanted. For what it's worth, I tried to talk my father out of it. Told him it was manipulative and unfair. But he's convinced he's protecting Theodore. From what? Naomi asked. From having a friend who isn't rich? From seeing the world outside his bubble? From becoming someone who actually gives a damn about people? From all of that, Victoria said quietly. My father believes wealth is a responsibility that requires isolation. That emotional connections to people outside our class are weaknesses that can be exploited. He's not trying to be cruel, in his mind, he's being practical. Protective. And nothing I say will change that worldview. She took Naomi's hand, her grip surprisingly strong. But you can change Theodore's. You already have. In 6 weeks, my brother has become someone I actually respect instead of just love out of obligation. He thinks about consequences now. He questions the system instead of just benefiting from it. He's trying to be better. And that's because of you. Then why is your father so determined to drive me away? Because Dad sees the change and interprets it as loss of control, Victoria said. Theodore was always going to inherit the business, take his place in the empire. But now he's talking about restructuring, about fair wages and ethical practices and using the family wealth for systemic change instead of charity galas. That threatens everything Dad's built. So in his mind, you're the problem. Remove you, and Theodore goes back to being manageable. Will he? Naomi asked. Go back to being manageable? Victoria smiled slightly. Not a chance. You've already changed him too much. But Dad doesn't realize that yet. So tonight, you play your part. Accept the award. Let Dad think he's won. And then... She leaned closer. Then you decide what you actually want. Not what's safe or smart or strategic. What you want. Because despite everything, you've earned that choice. Before Naomi could respond, Victoria was guiding her down the hallway, through the backstage area, toward the main ballroom where 500 of Portland's wealthiest people were eating a dinner that cost more per plate than Naomi made in a week. The ballroom was enormous, glittering, overwhelming. At the far end, a stage had been set up with a podium and massive screens displaying the Whitmore Foundation logo. And at a table near the stage, looking stiff and uncomfortable in his tuxedo, was Theodore. Their eyes met across the room. His expression was pained, apologetic, desperate. Hers was carefully blank, the armor she'd learned to wear when navigating spaces that didn't want her. Richard Whitmore took the stage, commanding attention effortlessly. He was a natural speaker, his voice carrying across the ballroom without seeming to strain, his presence filling the space. Tonight, we celebrate the Whitmore Foundation's continued commitment to making our city stronger, safer, and more prosperous, he began, and Naomi tuned out the corporate speak, the careful language that acknowledged problems without actually committing to solutions. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only 10 minutes, Richard's speech shifted. But before we continue with our program, I want to take a moment to honor someone truly exceptional. 6 weeks ago, my son Theodore was involved in a serious accident. He should have died. Would have died, if not for the extraordinary courage of one young woman. The screens lit up with footage Naomi had never seen, security camera video from a nearby building, showing her climbing through the car window, dragging Theodore out, throwing herself over him as the Mercedes exploded. It looked more dramatic than it had felt in the moment, more cinematic. The audience gasped, whispered. Naomi Wright, a waitress at a local diner, saw my son's car crash and made a choice, Richard continued. She chose to act when others watched. She chose courage when the safer option was available. She chose to value a stranger's life over her own safety. And because of that choice, my son is alive. Naomi felt Victoria's hand on her shoulder, gently pushing her toward the stage. She walked on legs that felt mechanical, every eye in the room tracking her movement, every face a blend of curiosity and assessment. She climbed the stairs to the stage. Richard turned to her, his smile warm and his eyes cold, calculating. He held out his hand, and she shook it, feeling the strength in his grip, the physical manifestation of power. Naomi Wright, on behalf of my family and the Whitmore Foundation, I want to present you with the Citizen Hero Award and a grant of $50,000 to be used however you see fit. The audience erupted in applause. $50,000. Enough to pay off her student loans. Enough for a car, an apartment, stability. Enough to change her life. All she had to do was accept it. Smile. Say thank you. Play the part Richard Whitmore had cast her in. Naomi took the crystal award he offered, heavy, cold, expensive. She stepped to the microphone, aware of Theodore watching from his table, of Victoria standing in the wings, of 500 wealthy strangers waiting to hear the grateful poor girl express her appreciation. And she made a choice. "Thank you," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "This is an incredible honor. And incredibly uncomfortable." A ripple went through the audience. Surprise, confusion. Richard's smile stiffened. "For 6 weeks," Naomi continued, "I've been learning about your world. The world of wealth and influence and the ability to solve problems with money. And I've learned that most people here genuinely want to help. You donate to charities. You attend galas. You give awards to people like me and feel good about yourselves." Theodore had stood up from his table, his expression alarmed. "But here's what I've also learned," Naomi said. "Charity isn't justice. Awards aren't systemic change. And $50,000 for one person doesn't fix the broken systems that create poverty in the first place." "Ms. Wright," Richard tried to interject, but Naomi kept talking. "I pulled Theodore Whitmore from a burning car because it was the right thing to do. Not for recognition. Not for reward. Just because it was right. And if we lived in a just society, that would be enough. But we don't. We live in a society where people like me work 45 hours a week and still can't afford rent. Where one medical emergency means bankruptcy. Where being poor is treated as a moral failing instead of a systemic problem." She held up the Crystal Award. "So I'm accepting this. But not for me. The $50,000 is going directly to the homeless shelter where Theodore has been volunteering. Because the people there need it more than I do. And because maybe, just maybe, it'll inspire some of you to look past charity galas and actually advocate for living wages, affordable housing, and systems that don't require people to nearly die before they catch a break." The ballroom was silent. Naomi could hear her own heartbeat, could feel 500 pairs of eyes on her, could see Richard Whitmore's face turning red with barely controlled fury. And then Theodore started clapping. He stood at his table, applauding, his expression proud and delighted and full of something that looked like love. Victoria joined him. Then Dr. Hall, the ER doctor who treated Theodore, stood and clapped. Then others, slowly at first, then building, until half the room was on their feet, applauding not because they agreed but because the drama was good, because Naomi had done something unexpected in a world of carefully scripted events. Richard Whitmore's jaw was tight, but he maintained his composure. "Thank you, Ms. Wright, for that passionate speech. Though I hope you'll reconsider the donation." "I won't," Naomi said firmly. She handed him the Crystal Award, walked off the stage, and kept walking, through the ballroom, past the elaborate decorations and expensive dresses and shocked faces, out into the cold December night. She made it halfway down the museum steps before Theodore caught up with her. "Naomi, wait." She stopped, turned. He looked ridiculous in his tuxedo, his bow tie already loosened, his hair disheveled from running. "That was incredible," he said, breathless and grinning. "Absolutely incredible. Did you see my father's face? I don't think anyone has ever challenged him like that in public before." "I just made an enemy of one of the most powerful men in Portland," Naomi said, reality crashing down now that the adrenaline was fading. "I'm so screwed." "No," Theodore said firmly. "You're not. Because I'm done letting my father control my life. And I'm definitely done letting him threaten people I care about." "Theodore." "I love you," he said, the words spilling out fast and urgent. "I know it's only been 6 weeks. I know we come from completely different worlds. I know there are 1,000 practical reasons why this is complicated. But I love you. Your courage, your integrity, your refusal to compromise who you are even when it would be easier. I love that you challenge me and call me on my privilege and make me want to be better. And I don't want there to be a last dinner. I want there to be hundreds of dinners. I want to build something real with you, something that isn't about transactions or obligations or my father's approval." Naomi stared at him, this billionaire's son in a tuxedo, standing on the steps of an art museum, declaring his love like they were in some kind of movie instead of real life with real consequences. "Your father is going to make my life hell," she said. "Then I'll help you fight him," Theodore said. "With lawyers, with resources, with whatever it takes. You're not alone in this anymore, Naomi. Not unless you choose to be." "I don't want your money," she said automatically. "I know. You've made that abundantly clear, twice now, in front of audiences." He smiled. "But I'm not offering money. I'm offering partnership. support, love. The chance to face whatever comes next together instead of alone. Naomi thought about the past 6 weeks. About dinners and conversations and the gradual realization that Theodore Whitmore, despite his privilege and his sheltered upbringing, was genuine in his desire to understand and to change. About the way her heart raced when she saw him. About the future she'd started imagining, not just survival, but actual life, with possibilities and choices and someone who saw her as more than just her circumstances. One condition, she said finally. Anything. Dinner number 8 is at my place. My real place, the room above the laundromat, with the heat that barely works and the view of a parking lot. If you can handle that reality instead of just talking about it over pad thai, then maybe we have a chance. Theodore's smile was brilliant, transforming his whole face. Deal. When? Tomorrow night. 6 o'clock. Bring wine. Cheap wine, nothing fancy. And be prepared for my landlord to interrogate you about your intentions. I can't wait, Theodore said. He reached for her hand, hesitated. Is this okay? Naomi took his hand, lacing their fingers together. Yeah, this is okay. They stood there on the museum steps, a billionaire's son and a waitress, holding hands and facing the uncertain future together while inside, the gala continued without them. It wasn't a perfect solution. Richard Whitmore's displeasure was a real threat. The class differences between them would create ongoing challenges. The world would judge their relationship, question Naomi's motives, assume Theodore was slumming or she was gold digging. But for the first time in 3 years, Naomi felt something she'd almost forgotten. Not just possibility, but hope. Real, complicated, terrifying hope. 6 months after the gala, Naomi stood in the doorway of what would soon be the Brightside Community Center, watching construction workers install the last of the solar panels on the roof. The building, a former warehouse on 82nd Avenue, had been gutted and reimagined. Classrooms for job training, a commercial kitchen for culinary programs, a computer lab, office space for social workers, and a small cafe that would employ people transitioning out of homelessness. It was Theodore's idea, funded by his trust fund, the one he'd gained access to on his 26th birthday over his father's strenuous objections. But it was Naomi's vision, designed from her lived experience of what people actually needed instead of what wealthy donors thought they needed. Looking good, Theodore said, appearing beside her with 2 coffees from the daily grind. He'd learned her order by heart. Black coffee, medium, nothing fancy. Some things didn't need to change. It's terrifying, Naomi admitted, taking the cup gratefully. What if we built this and nobody comes? What if it doesn't actually help? Then we'll adjust, Theodore said, the same answer he'd given every time her anxiety spiraled. We'll listen to what the community needs and adapt. That's what makes this different from my father's foundation. We're not dictating solutions from above. We're building them from the ground up, with the people we're trying to serve. Naomi leaned against him, fitting naturally into the space under his arm. 6 months hadn't erased all the complications. Richard Whitmore still barely spoke to his son, still made thinly veiled comments about inappropriate relationships and youthful mistakes. The Portland social scene had been predictably judgmental, with whispers about gold diggers and slumming billionaires that followed them to every event they attended. But 6 months had proven that what they'd built was real. Theodore had moved out of his family's estate and into a modest apartment in southeast Portland. Not Naomi's room above the laundromat, which had been too small for 2 people, but a 2-bedroom in a working-class neighborhood where the neighbors were teachers and mechanics and small business owners. He'd taken a position at a non-profit focused on housing justice, using his business degree and family connections for something meaningful, making a fraction of what he could have earned at Whitmore Industries but coming home satisfied instead of empty. Naomi had finished her online social work certification and was now the community director for the Brightside Center. A real title with a real salary, $55,000 a year, more than she'd ever made, enough to start rebuilding her life on stable ground. She still picked up occasional shifts at Rose's diner, not because she needed to financially, but because Rosie had been there during her worst times, and loyalty mattered. Victoria called, Theodore said, pulling out his phone. She wants to bring a potential donor by next week, someone from the tech sector who's interested in funding the computer lab expansion. Your sister is terrifying in the best way, Naomi said. Victoria had become an unexpected ally, using her legal expertise and social connections to support the center while maintaining a careful neutrality in the ongoing Cold War between Theodore and their father. Remind me to buy her lunch. She'd prefer you just keep being you, Theodore said. She told me last week that you're the best thing that ever happened to this family, even if Dad's too stubborn to see it. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the workers finish the solar installation. In the parking lot, Naomi's car, a used Honda Civic, 8 years old but reliable, purchased with part of the award money she'd eventually accepted after the shelter's director had convinced her that self-sacrifice wasn't the same as integrity, sat next to Theodore's Subaru. They'd sold the Mercedes months ago, donated the proceeds to homeless services. "I have something for you," Theodore said, reaching into his jacket pocket. "Before you panic, it's not what you think." He pulled out a small velvet box, and Naomi's heart jumped into her throat. "Theodore." "It's not a ring," he said quickly, opening the box to reveal a key. "At least, not that kind of commitment. Not yet. Not until you're ready, and maybe not ever if you don't want that. But it's a key to the center. Your center. Because in 2 weeks, we open, and you're going to be leading this thing. And I wanted you to have something tangible to mark the moment when you stopped just surviving and started building the life you deserve." Naomi took the key, her eyes burning with tears. It was simple, brass, with a tag that read Director, N. Wright. Nothing fancy. Nothing expensive. But it represented something she'd never thought she'd have: ownership, agency, a future she'd helped create instead of just endure. "Thank you," she whispered, "for believing this was possible when I didn't." "You did the hard part," Theodore said. "You survived. You kept your integrity. You saved my life in more ways than one. I just provided some resources and got out of your way." Naomi kissed him, there in the doorway of their shared dream, tasting coffee and hope and the complicated joy of building something meaningful together. The Brightside Community Center opened on a Saturday morning in late June, and the line stretched around the block. Naomi had expected maybe 50 people for the first day, a modest turnout, enough to justify the investment, enough to build on. Instead, 300 people showed up, individuals and families who'd heard about the free job training, the computer classes, the social work services, the cafe that hired people with barriers to employment. Word had spread through the networks that connected Portland's struggling communities. The shelters, the food banks, the places where people who'd been failed by the system gathered to help each other survive. Rosie cut the ribbon, her eyes wet with proud tears. "This is what real change looks like," she announced to the crowd. "Not charity from people who'll never understand what it's like to struggle, but opportunity created by someone who's lived it. Who knows what you need because she's needed it too. Naomi Wright is one of us, and she hasn't forgotten where she came from. This center is proof of that." The applause was thunderous. Naomi gave a short speech, her voice shaking but clear. She talked about the 3 years she'd spent homeless or nearly homeless, about eating garbage at dump sites, about the desperation of never having enough. She talked about the night she'd pulled Theodore from a burning car, about the choice she'd made to act instead of walk away, about how that single decision had cascaded into opportunities she'd never imagined. "But here's what's important," she said, looking out at the crowd of faces that reflected her own past struggles. "I got lucky. One night, one action, one connection to someone with resources, that changed my trajectory. But luck shouldn't be the difference between thriving and drowning. Systems should support people, not fail them. Communities should lift people up, not let them fall through the cracks. And that's what we're trying to build here. Not luck, but reliable support. Not charity, but opportunity. Not saving people, but giving them the tools to save themselves." She caught Theodore's eye in the crowd. He was standing with Victoria, both of them applauding, both of them looking proud. Behind them, almost hidden in the back, was a figure Naomi hadn't expected to see: Richard Whitmore. He wasn't applauding. But he was there. Watching. And maybe, just maybe, starting to understand. The cafe's first customer was a woman named Janet, 47 years old, who'd been living in her car for 8 months after medical bankruptcy. She ordered coffee and a breakfast sandwich, her hand shaking as she counted out change for the $5 meal, priced deliberately low, subsidized by the center, designed to offer dignity instead of handouts. "It's on the house," said Marcus, the cafe manager, who Naomi had hired after learning he'd lost his construction job and couldn't find work because of a criminal record from 20 years ago. "First meal is always free. And if you're looking for work, we're hiring. Kitchen staff, no experience necessary, training provided." Janet's face crumpled. "Really?" "Really," Marcus said gently. "Fill out an application before you leave. We'll review it and get back to you within 48 hours. And even if this position doesn't work out, there are other programs here, job training, resume help, social workers who can connect you with resources. Naomi watched the interaction from across the cafe, her throat tight with emotion. This was what mattered. Not grand gestures or charity galas or awards. Just people helping people, creating opportunities, building systems that caught people before they fell too far. Theodore appeared beside her, slipping his hand into hers. You did it, he said quietly. You built something real. We did it, Naomi corrected. Together. Together, he agreed. Then, after a pause, my father asked to meet with you. Privately. Said he has something he wants to discuss. Naomi's stomach tightened. 6 months of Cold War, of passive-aggressive comments, of Richard Whitmore's obvious disapproval. Do I have to? No, Theodore said firmly. You never have to do anything you're uncomfortable with. But Victoria thinks he might actually be coming around. Seeing the center, seeing the real impact, it's harder to dismiss as youthful idealism when there are 300 people here who needed exactly this. Okay, Naomi said after a moment. I'll meet with him. But on my terms, in my space. He wants to talk. He can come to my office. I love it when you're fierce, Theodore said, kissing her temple. Richard Whitmore appeared at Naomi's office door 3 days later, looking strangely diminished without his usual entourage. He wore a suit, still immaculate, but his expression was harder to read than usual, less controlled, more uncertain. Mr. Whitmore, Naomi said, standing but not moving to shake his hand. What can I do for you? I came to apologize, he said, and the words seemed to cost him something. And to offer you something. May I sit? Naomi gestured to the chair across from her desk, a simple space, decorated with children's drawings from the center's art class and photos of their first successful job placements. Richard sat carefully, looking around the office like he was cataloging everything. I've been unfair to you, he began. When Theodore told me about your relationship, I made assumptions. Saw you as a threat instead of a person. Tried to manipulate the situation to protect my son from what I perceived as a gold digger using tragedy as leverage. I'm aware, Naomi said coolly. I was wrong. The admission seemed to pain him. You're not after our money. You've proven that repeatedly, in ways that honestly baffled me. You refused my initial offer. You gave away the award money. You've built this center using Theodore's trust fund, but every financial decision is transparent, accountable, focused on actual impact rather than personal gain. He paused. You're exactly what my son said you were, someone with integrity that can't be bought. Naomi waited, not making this easier for him. I've spent 40 years building wealth, Richard continued. Teaching my children that success meant profit, that business was about winning, that sentiment was weakness. And watching Theodore this past 6 months, watching him find purpose, satisfaction, genuine happiness doing work that matters, made me realize I taught him everything except how to live a meaningful life. He pulled an envelope from his jacket and placed it on her desk. This is a donation to the Brightside Center. $5 million. No strings attached. Use it however you see fit. Expansion, endowment, additional programs. I trust your judgment more than I'd trust any committee my foundation might assemble. Naomi stared at the envelope. Why? Because my son loves you, Richard said simply. And because you've made him into someone I'm actually proud of instead of just grooming for succession. Because this center, what you've built here, is more impressive than anything I've accomplished with 40 years and billions of dollars. And because I'm 73 years old, and I'd like to know my son before I die. Which means making peace with the woman who's become his partner. He stood, straightening his suit. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I'm asking for the chance to do better. To support what you're building, both here and with Theodore. No interference. No manipulation. Just support. Naomi looked at the envelope, then at Richard Whitmore. 6 months ago, she would have thrown the money back in his face, would have seen only strings and manipulation and power plays. But 6 months of building the center, of watching Theodore evolve, of learning that people were capable of growth and change, even people who seemed irredeemably set in their ways, had taught her something about grace. Okay, she said finally. But I have conditions. Name them. First, this donation goes through the same transparent process as every other funding source. Public records, board approval, regular audits. No special treatment because you're Theodore's father. Agreed. Second, you stop trying to control Theodore's life. His choices are his own: career, relationships, future. You can offer advice, but you have to accept his decisions even when you disagree. That's harder, Richard admitted. But yes. Agreed. Third, you volunteer here. 4 hours a week, doing whatever needs doing. I don't care if you're a billionaire. If you want to support this center, you need to understand the people we serve. That means showing up, doing work, actually seeing the reality of poverty instead of just theorizing about it from boardrooms. Richard's eyebrows rose. You want me to volunteer? Doing what, exactly? Whatever needs doing, Naomi repeated. Could be administrative work. Could be serving meals in the cafe. Could be sitting with people and actually listening to their stories. The point is to be present, useful, and humble. Think you can handle that? A long pause. Then, surprisingly, Richard smiled, a real smile, the first genuine one Naomi had ever seen from him. You don't make anything easy, do you? Life isn't easy for most people, Naomi said. Why should it be easy for you? Fair point. He extended his hand. Deal. And Ms. Wright? Thank you for not giving up on my son. Or on me. Naomi shook his hand, and for the first time, it felt like a gesture between equals instead of a power play. 1 year later. The wedding was small, held at the Brightside Community Center on a Sunday afternoon when the building was closed to the public. Naomi wore a simple white dress she'd found at a consignment shop, alterations done by Mrs. Chen from the laundromat who'd become a friend. Theodore wore a dark suit, his bow tie slightly crooked because he'd insisted on tying it himself despite his complete lack of skill. Rosie officiated. She'd gotten ordained online specifically for this purpose, had cried through the entire ceremony despite her claim that she didn't do emotions. Victoria stood as Naomi's maid of honor, having become the sister Naomi had never had. Marcus walked Naomi down the aisle, because he'd given her a chance when no one else would, and that kind of loyalty deserved recognition. Richard Whitmore sat in the front row next to his ex-wife Catherine. They divorced 6 months ago, a long overdue end to a marriage that had been more business partnership than love. Catherine had taken her settlement and started a domestic violence shelter, crediting Naomi's example for inspiring her to finally pursue something meaningful. Richard sat beside her, applauding when Theodore kissed his bride, and if there were tears in his eyes, no one mentioned it. The reception was potluck. Guests had been asked to bring a dish instead of gifts, and the tables groaned with food that represented the diversity of Portland's communities. The cafe staff had made the cake, a lopsided but delicious creation decorated with frosting flowers. This is perfect, Naomi whispered to Theodore during their first dance, swaying to Etta James in the center's main hall, surrounded by people who'd become family through choice rather than blood. You're perfect, Theodore said, pulling her closer. Though I still can't believe you made my father volunteer in the cafe. He came home last week talking about the intricacies of espresso extraction. I think he's actually enjoying it. People can change, Naomi said. You taught me that. You taught me everything that matters, Theodore countered. How to see people. How to act with integrity. How to build a life that's about meaning instead of money. Naomi kissed him. There in the center they'd built together, surrounded by the community they'd helped strengthen. Outside, Portland continued its complicated life, poverty and wealth existing side by side, systems failing some while supporting others, the ongoing work of justice and equity grinding forward incrementally. But inside the Brightside Community Center, for one perfect afternoon, there was only celebration. Only love. Only the proof that one person's choice to act, to help, to refuse to walk away could ripple outward in ways impossible to predict. Naomi had saved Theodore's life that rainy November night. But in all the ways that really mattered, he'd saved hers too. Together, they'd built something neither could have created alone, a partnership based on equality, a love that transcended class boundaries, a life devoted to lifting others up instead of just climbing higher themselves. And that, Naomi thought as she danced with her husband surrounded by their chosen family, was what wealth really meant. Not money. Not power. But connection. Purpose. The ability to make the world a little less cruel for the people struggling to survive in it. That was everything. As we close Naomi and Theodore's story, From a burning car to a wedding at the community center they built together, it reminds us that true transformation happens when privilege meets purpose, when survival becomes service, and when two people from different worlds choose to build a bridge instead of accepting the divide. Their journey shows us that one act of courage can change multiple lives, that love can cross any boundary when it's built on respect and shared values, and that real wealth isn't measured in bank accounts but in the lives we touch and the communities we strengthen. What will your moment be? When faced with the choice to walk away or step forward, to stay safe or act with courage, to accept divisions or build bridges, what will you choose? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for experiencing this journey with me. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs to hear it.